Afternoon. I hope you all had lovely lunch. They're not too tired, and they had enough coffee to go through the afternoon, where there are many, many interesting things before us. The first thing in line is this session on where we're going to discuss culture democracy, or the concept that's made out of two possibly the most contested terms there are, culture and democracy. I'm not going to get into the details of what culture democracy is. We touched upon this topic already in the morning, about the tensions between the democratization of culture and cultural democracy. But I will say that the rise of culture democracy in the second half of the past century marked one of the most profound shifts in the culture policy landscapes by opening up perspectives for recognition and inclusion of diverse voices in public decision making. The adaptation of culture democracy ideal has been gradually defragmented in culture policy rhetoric, supporting or providing loopholes for the hyper-instrumentalized approaches and imperatives that are set before the culture development and culture policy provisions. Here we are talking about the display of culture policy agendas presented in the rhetoric of social inclusion, culture diversity, access to culture, intercultural dialogue, equal opportunities and culture participation, all the key concepts that are now becoming the key buzzwords of the culture policies. This display, or these buzzwords, are mirrored in the proper of the culture reality, exemplified by decreasing and unequally redistributed funds for culture, shrinking infrastructure and space for the arts of culture, blurring of culture policy and its relevance with the more important areas like commerce and economy, lesser freedom on individual levels, deteriorating communities and collectives, public sense, over-reliance on precarious work in the arts and culture, etc. This all brings us to one crucial question that we'll try to tackle in this session, and which is the key question of culture democracy. The relation between the traditional hierarchies and distribution of power and the issue of representation, involving questions on who decides, how they involved in the decision-making processes, how they represented in public, and what kind of governance does this involve and demand. So today with us we have a really interesting group of experts, academics, practitioners, cultural workers, activists from all over, all parts of the world. And I will kindly ask them to introduce themselves as they go. The technicalities of the session will be as following. Each speaker will have 10 to 15 minutes to present their case, their views on how they unpack the concept of culture democracy from the standing point of contemporary cultural policy development and culture development in general. And then we're going to go from one to through all the 5 speakers, and later we shall take the questions from the public. So we'll start with Sakarias Sokka from Finland.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, brief introduction. I come from Center for Cultural Policy Research, CUPORE, in Finland, where we have different kind of research teams, and one of the central teams is cultural participation and cultural rights. Personally, I have a background in university. I worked for a while in the University of Jyväskylä, where we have had master's program in cultural policy. I have studied institutionalism of Finnish cultural, institutionalization of Finnish cultural policy, and also participation in cultural services in Finland. And not just services, but also people's opinions about decision making about cultural services. And Anna kindly reminded me that I should remind you the existence of the Nordic Journal of Cultural Policy, Nordisk Kulturpolitisk Tidskrift, of which I am the current editor, because in 2016 there was this theme issue of cultural participation, and it's totally open access, so just Google Nordic Journal of Cultural Policy, you will find it if you are interested. Okay, and I proceed straight on. Okay, yeah. So, in my case, I start with the concepts. Apparently there are various dimensions in cultural policy that relate to cultural democracy. Like Anna just told us, cultural diversity, multiculturalism, inclusion, access, participation, and cultural rights, and so on. But what are we talking about when we discuss cultural democracy? What is democracy? It, like any other abstract concept, can be defined in a variety of ways, and I'm sure that tonight we will hear a theoretical presentation of democracy, which is very interesting. Here, I understand it simply as being concerned with the mechanisms through which individuals can contribute to the making of decisions. That's it. It's convenient when we talk about participation. What comes to culture, I understand it as the signifying system through which a social order is communicated, reproduced, experienced, and explored. Some of you know that this comes from Raymond Williams, his understanding of culture. And in that kind of definition, what actually matters in production of culture are the signifying practices like art, mode, literature, heritage, and so on, that give meaning, produce, and reproduce the world that we share with other people. In addition, I understand that cultural policy itself refers to a specific policy field with identifiable political and administrative institutions like departments of ministries and arm's-length bodies, and that governments on national, regional, and local is important when we talk about participation, levels have decided to include in a politically defined cultural sector. That's a definition by Norwegian professor Geir Westheim. Any policy always refers to regularizing aspects of politics that imply the coordination of acts and measure and regulate the inclusion and exclusion of activities. Overall, administrators at all levels produce policies. Even the routine workers are important for making policies work. Policies are made of a variety of components in a production process that consists of principles, policy lines, measures, and practices. According to the idea of cultural democracy, cultural policies should be formulated in relation to the everyday cultural needs of the population. For example, two documents from 1970s, exactly from 1974, a committee report on cultural policy in Finland and a parliamentary decision on cultural policy in Sweden, they both emphasized the importance of social equity. And during those days, Nordic welfare states were developing and aimed to provide an equality of possibilities to all citizens. This reflects the idea of universalism that is essential for the Nordic welfare state model. In Finland, the strong emphasis on the availability and accessibility of cultural services at the end of the 1970s strengthened and reformed cultural services and activities both locally and at regional and national level. However, both organization and implementation of public cultural policies still often cultivate exclusive practices, inequality and elitism. Swedish professor Roger Blomgren has stated that cultural democracy has actually never played a major role in the implementation of cultural policy in Sweden. I'm tempted to claim the same for Finland. One reason for this might be that in the Nordic countries, but also elsewhere, art in a narrow sense was positioned in the center of cultural policies in the early stages of the institutional development. Indeed, also the emphasis on cultural democracy in the cultural policies of 60s and 70s was tied to an understanding of cultural policies where art, in this narrow sense, is central. This tells us that transfers in expressed policy goals don't necessarily really change that much. Not that much the guiding principles nor implementations of cultural policies. In other words, popular ideas of the day may change, but it's much harder to change the structures and institutions that generate and implement the actual policies. During the emergence of cultural democracy in 1970s, many hierarchies of arts world and cultural administration were already strongly tied to high culture norms. At that stage, institutions had been developed for decades in a similar way in Finland. Old institutions and established structures tend to have a memory of their own, that bureaucratic procedures and structural hierarchies maintain. When we talk of cultural democracy, we should scrutinize the social and structural power structures that influence inequalities. For example, do the existing institutions have means to understand cultural differentiation in relation to power structures? Early proponents of cultural democracy claimed that there were shadows of colonialism in top-down democratization of culture, as its aim was to disseminate particular national culture and make certain cultural values available to all. Thus, for instance, cultural minorities faced an institutionalized lack of respect for their cultures and values. The same tendency is still alive in many places, which brings us to representations. Who decides what and how becomes represented in public? Answering the questions is strongly connected to how culture is being administrated within a named society. But at the same time, this question is always valid, regardless of where it's asked and when. Another important question is qualifying practices and quality judgments, which exposes a dilemma between exclusive and inclusive views. In any case, it would be important to promote the objectiveness of the criteria used for evaluating any forms of culture. Questions like representations and qualifications are obviously tied to the question of participation. During the last 4 years, I've been involved in some research projects that have illustrated obstacles and barriers for participation in culture in Finland. Not even in such a society like Finland that's known to aim for equality can social stratification be overlooked when we discuss participation in cultural life. Education, age, gender and income are important factors in explaining why people do not participate. Moreover, when we asked about abilities to participate in decision making, we got depressing results. Vast majority of our respondents felt unable to have effect upon service provision. In short, people don't see themselves as having much power to remove barriers of participation to culture. The officers who are responsible of organizing the services actually recognize the barriers but lack means to improve the situation. There evidently is a lack of democracy here. It is a common presumption in political theory that the normative legitimacy of a democratic decision depends on the degree to which those affected by it have been included in the decision-making processes and have had the opportunity to influence the outcomes. People's ability to take part in public discussion is vital for both culture and functioning of democracy. In essence, cultural democracy is a matter of taking part, being able to express oneself and have influence on production of culture. In Nordic countries, corporatist relations between public authorities and cultural life have been important and still prevail. It's been usual to protect culture from markets by guaranteeing institutional autonomy to the actors of the cultural field. Here, the danger lies in the fact that policy processes may easily become biased and affected by non-transparent reasoning that serve the interests of selected private individuals and groups instead of public interests. It's a question of how democracy is understood. When autonomy is given to institutions and organizations that are controlled by experts, their professional and individual interests may become more important than larger-scale welfare of the society as whole, which lead to a situation that can be called democratic elitism. All this points toward considering the position of citizen in the making of policies. More democratic cultural policies call for new types of structures and organizing of cultural activities with multiple actors in diverse settings. Another previous project of ours showed that participatory solutions indeed increase cooperation between the public sector, the third sector, and even private firms. Participatory administration models give a face to public sector actors and bring new knowledge for administration to develop its services, and vice versa. When the cooperation and movement of people, knowledge and new ideas is not working, a major obstacle to participation arises. The experts and professionals in the field often possess the knowledge and that is generally needed, but citizen participation adds experience and multiple values-based knowledge to the policy processes. Here, the difficulty lies in the development of real participation instead of symbolic hearing of the otherwise ignored groups. It requires a communicative interplay that would identify both public and civic institutions as potential sites for democratic communication among citizens and between public officers and citizens. It also requires dialogue at local level, where residents of the neighborhoods are the actual experts of their own living environments. In Finland, the difficulty lies in the fact that the municipal organization is rigid when it comes to adopting new modes of operation, which may develop defensive attitudes to change. Nevertheless, more direct involvement of people can strengthen the legitimacy of policymaking and at the same time generate widespread beliefs of procedural justice. Questions of what gets on the agenda, who has decision power, and how participants take positions are crucial for democracy. Demolishing existing institutions is not the solution to make things better, but there are many questions to ask about the institutional settings. Do the actors who have power within the institutionalized structures have courage to accept new actors in roles that until now have been occupied by the experts? Do the current processes encourage information sharing? Do the existing instruments ask people what they value? In short, are the institutions sensitive to communication processes that reflect the needs, problems and creative ideas of the people? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm an intruder because I'm Gianluca Cheli from Kilowatt Festival Bispectactive, and I should have talked tomorrow morning, but here I am. I'm here to tell you our experience as a festival, as a European network in active spectatorship. And I would like to apologize for my English because I learned it looking Narcos and Breaking Bad, so it's not so good as you expected. But I hope that you understand what I would like to say. Kilowatt Festival, born in 2003, and I was a kid. Yes, I was a kind of a kid, and it was a festival for us. For me and from the artistic director, and then a technician. Yes, it was the third edition, says to us, guys, okay, it's a cool festival, but this festival is for us. No one from the town, no one from the city, from the area. And he said, if you want to keep going during this festival, you probably have to find a way to involve the town. And we start with this crazy idea of co-programming with people, with citizens. And visionari, that in Italian means people that so things, you know, like me, that I am a vision of tomorrow. And they work for 6 months, watching videos of show, reading projects of young companies, and then they choose 9 shows for the festival. You know, I'm in charge to coordinate the visionary work. So sometimes they do a wonderful work, sometimes don't. But it's a responsibility, you know? We decide to share the responsibility of programming, of investing even money on some artists. And we, 4 years ago, we decided to try to make this project a European project. And Bispectactive will be the results of this crazy idea. We won this project, and now we have 12 groups of visionary all around Europe. And so this is the experience. I think that it's better if someone wants to, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts on the notion of cultural democracy. This idea, like many cultural policy themes, yeah.
Introduce yourself.
I am. Give me a break. Gee, there are ways of doing this. Sorry, just kidding. I believe that this idea of cultural democracy, like many cultural policy themes, has different meanings depending on the political, economic, and social cultural context in which it is applied. So my reflections will be informed by my South African experience, and particularly by having served as an advisor to the First Minister responsible for arts and culture in a post-apartheid dispensation, but also my serving as part of UNESCO's technical facility on the 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, and my work across the African continent in the cultural policy arena, most recently in the African Cultural Policy Network. So, much like colonialism, apartheid South Africa had as one of its premises the idea that white people were more fully human than black people, so that people of darker hue were essentially forced to serve as cheap labor to create wealth and support the lifestyles of their white counterparts. The post-apartheid constitution, however, affirmed all citizens, irrespective of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, religious belief, and the like, as equals with the same fundamental rights and freedoms, so that our country's first white paper on arts, culture, and heritage, adopted in 1996, was premised on cultural democracy principles, such as everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts. That's Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the doors of learning and culture shall be open, a clause in the Freedom Charter adopted by Nelson Mandela's African National Congress as their guiding document from the 1950s, even before they were banned. So with the apartheid legacy of huge disparities between the white and black populations to address in health, in education, employment, and other sectors of society, policymakers in the arts and culture arena were obliged to take the 5 fish and 2 loaves of bread approach, which is to use the same amount of money that was made available to serve the white minority cultural interests under apartheid, now to fund and serve the cultural aspirations of all in a democratic South Africa. So whereas censorship was a key feature of preserving the apartheid status quo, with music, theatre, literature, and films that were critical of the regime or which conflicted with the conservative religious values of the ruling party being banned or restricted, freedom of creative expression is now enshrined in the country's constitution, along with other features of a modern democratic state. To give effect to these principles of cultural democracy in our new society, initial cultural policy premised on principles of human rights and freedoms stipulated the following 4 or 5 things. 1, that public funding to support the creation and distribution of creative work would be made available and channeled through an independent arts council and an independent film and video foundation that existed at arm's length to government. These would be governed by respected individuals within the arts, and they would make decisions about the allocation of funding based on artistic merit as opposed to decisions being made by government officials. Secondly, that cultural infrastructure in the form of multifunctional arts centers would be distributed throughout the country, particularly in areas marginalized by apartheid, with such centers providing infrastructure both to creative practitioners to create and distribute their work, but also to audiences to be able to access visual art, theatre, dance, music, film, and the like that would tour to such centers. Thirdly, arts education would be introduced at school level for all learners to educate and develop new audiences, as well as provide the basis for vocational training for those who wish to pursue professional careers in the arts. Fourth, the governance and management of publicly funded institutions like museums, theatres, and galleries would reflect the demographics of our country in terms of race and gender, rather than only that of a white minority as in the past, and so ensure that the aesthetic and cultural programming of these institutions would better reflect the aspirations of all South Africans. So on the one hand, to concretize the practice of freedom of expression, access to funding, to infrastructure, and the governance of publicly funded institutions were to be democratized. And on the other, for people to enjoy and participate in the cultural life of the community, access to appropriate infrastructure was decentralized. An integral feature of the democratization process of cultural policy at that particular time was the participation of artists and professional groups through organizations that they themselves had created in the research and formulation of and advocacy of policies that served their interests. No longer were artists to be the subjects of policy created by governments, but within a democracy, they would have the right to determine the policies and participate in the structures and funding mechanisms that govern their lives. So 21 years after the adoption of the original cultural policy, our Department of Arts and Culture is now in the final throes of updating that policy, and that's taken them about 4 years to do so. But rather than the human rights premises of the 1996 cultural policy, the current draft foregrounds the creative and cultural industries as key contributors in addressing the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality in our country. Because you see, after 2 decades of the promise of a better life for all, our reality is now that 55% of our population lives below the poverty line. We have an unofficial unemployment rate of 26%, but which unofficially is closer to 38%. And we are now one of the most unequal societies in the world, with the top 20% of our citizens earn 70% of national income, with the bottom 40% earning between 6 and 7%. Cultural policy now is then determined by the need to address these challenges, and hence the concentration on the culture and creative industries, in the mistaken belief that these will contribute to economic growth, which will then trickle down into social and human development. So where does this leave our cultural democracy as envisaged in the 1996 white paper? Well, first, cultural infrastructure remains largely concentrated in the wealthier urban centres, with our country's richest province, Gauteng, where Johannesburg and Pretoria are, having 3 nationally subsidised theatres, while the 5 poorer provinces in our country has none. Everyone may now apply to the National Arts Council for funding, but given the need and the relatively small budget of the Arts Council, recipients receive hardly enough to support the creation, let alone the distribution of a project. It's a kind of Father Christmas approach where many people get little amounts as opposed to substantial enough amounts to be able to really produce work. Thirdly, publicly funded institutions are now more demographically representative, and this has helped to change the programming of these institutions. But they've also become the conduits to the trough of public funding for new elites, with battles to control these institutions in order to feed the public trough, often superseding the need to serve people's cultural needs and aspirations through these institutions. The names of streets and buildings have been changed, new public monuments erected to reflect the icons of those who now wield power, rather than participation by people in effecting these particular changes. Fifth, government ignored existing professional and artist-created bodies to initiate their own Creative and Cultural Industries Federation, CIFSA, a sweetheart body that supposedly represents the creative sector, but which in its 3 years of existence has done nothing to earn the respect of the creative sector, which it is supposed to represent. So democracy is undermined in the sector by the creation of a body whose leadership is dependent upon government for funding, so that their critical voice is compromised. As for addressing the needs of the poor through the creative industries, ironically, this market-driven approach continues to exclude the poor, who are still overwhelmingly black and who still do not have the disposable income to spend on creative products. And it is those who benefited from apartheid who most have the resources, the networks, and the markets to take advantage of publicly funded infrastructure or to privatize cultural access in our contemporary society. So while all citizens have the right to freedom of expression and to participate in the cultural life of the community, inevitably, it is those with resources, with education, with networks, and recognizable brands that are best able to do so, thus making a mockery of the notion of cultural democracy. Now, this national scenario also plays itself out at a global level. The cultural hegemony of the West has been developed through the colonial period and asserted more recently through globalization. whose values and ideas dominate, whose way of life is valorized, which perspectives on world events carry the most influence, which victims of terror are humanized, depends on who has global or regional reach through news and media outlets, audiovisual products and distribution networks, and access to digital platforms. With the demise of our bipolar world at the end of the 80s and the rise of the dominance of the free market globally, the 2005 UNESCO Convention was designed to ensure global cultural democracy. Should the free market be allowed free rein in the creative industry sector, it was argued, then products and services from dominant economies would flood the markets of less resourced countries. And consumers would then not only enjoy those products, but they would also internalize the values, the perspectives of the world, the beliefs embedded within those products. These imported television programs, movies, literature, music, and the like. The convention thus grants states the right to subsidize their own creative industries, to provide alternatives to imported products, without this being regarded as unfair interventions in the marketplace. It encourages all countries to contribute to the International Fund for Cultural Diversity, which would support the creative industries in poorer countries. And they would also provide preferential access to global north markets for creative goods and services from the global south. In this way, it was argued, fairer trade in cultural goods and services would be enhanced, global cultural democracy would be promoted through the distribution of ideas, values, and worldviews embedded in creative goods and services. But as with the South African scenario, though, the convention has largely served the trade interests of wealthier countries who may protect and promote their cultural turf locally, regionally, and globally, while less resourced countries continue to be consumers rather than players in the global creative economy. According to UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, for example, Africa's share of the creative economy over the last number of years remains at below 1%. That's a combination of 54 countries. Africa, though, has been the primary beneficiary of the International Fund for Cultural Diversity, people would tell us, consuming 46% of the total funds allocated over the last number of years. But when you realize that this fund over 10 to 12 years has gathered a little under $9 million, 46% of that total is not even the marketing budget of the average Hollywood movie. So as for preferential access to global north markets, security concerns and the rise of national chauvinism, as you folk here in Europe would be very familiar with, have severely restricted the entry of artists and other creative professionals from Africa, Asia, the Arab region, into these global north markets. This year, the governing bodies responsible for the convention invited civil society organizations to submit a global report on the achievements and challenges of civil society in implementing the convention. The Civil Society Forum was held in Paris in June to initiate this process, and with the report to be delivered by November for consideration by the Intergovernmental Committee in December. Inevitably, though, this process was dominated by our Western European colleagues, with little or no input from the Arab region, from Latin America, from large parts of Asia, the Pacific, the Caribbean, and even from Eastern Europe. And yet a report was compiled to be submitted as the Civil Society Report. As the African Cultural Policy Network, we withdrew from the process and submitted our own report to ensure that our voice would be heard independently and not be mediated through the dominant interest and voice of Western Europeans. Civil society itself reflects, then, the fundamental and structural inequities of our time, so that cultural democracy, which the convention ironically seeks to promote, is compromised and diluted. To conclude, then, if we are serious about cultural democracy, we urgently need to address structural inequality on the one hand, in order to ensure that those on the underside of history are empowered with the skills, the resources, and the knowledge to act boldly and confidently in their interests. On the other hand, we need to address privilege, to make those who have, and who always have had, and who might even believe that they are cultural democrats. We need to make them aware of the ways in which their privilege and the exercising of that privilege actually restricts and undermines cultural democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I agree with much of what you said. And I will not be totally different. So my name is Jean-Louis Fabiani. I'm a sociologist. I apologize for that. And I am now currently affiliated with Central European University in Budapest. I would like to start with an anecdote that struck me. I worked for 15 years at the Festival d'Avignon as a sociologist, but also as a cultural activist. I worked with high school students from poor areas in the north and the east of France who were invited to come freely for 1 week at the festival. And I mean, there is a historical fact in the history of the festival that is about participation. So you know that Jean Villard, who created the festival 70 years ago, is still a political and artistic icon in France. And his dream, I mean, the motto of his work in Avignon was to transform or to turn the spectator into a participant. And in July 68, so 2 months after May 68, that was very important in France, as you know, Jean Villard had invited the Living Theatre from New York City with Julian Beck and Judith Malina. And of course, it was a very hot festival with a lot of debates just right after May 68. And an evening, Julian Beck and Judith Malina invited the public to come on stage and, I mean, to get themselves naked. And Jean Villard was absolutely destroyed by the event. He could not understand. It's not participation. It's an orgy. I cannot accept this type of thing. And Jean Villard died 6 months after, in total despair. So this point about what should be participation, and I gave the keynote of the Kilowatt Festival 2 years ago, and they are pioneers in redefining, I hope you will talk about it during the discussion, redefining what is participation for the public. Second point, I think you mentioned inequality, and there are growing inequalities in the artistic world too. We don't speak about it frequently. We talk about the populations, but of course the overproduction of artists is not new. Okay, it has lasted for maybe more than 1 century. So more and more people want to be artists. Okay, it's the statistical fact, and I mean the slots are not that many. And more, we are in situations, due to the market, of winners take it all. This fall in New York City, in Broadway, to get a seat to listen to Bruce Springsteen, it will cost you around $900. And the record is held by Betty Midler, and the new musical, the seats will go for more than $1,000. So more and more huge remunerations for great artists, and concentration of reputation due to globalization and to the marketization of everything. So one of the issues for us is also to think about the decommodification of culture, especially to fight this lack of balance between the West or the North and the rest of the world. So I would say that contemporary expressive styles are no longer associated with the state apparatus, understood as a device that produces legitimate symbolic order through what Bourdieu, who was mentioned this morning, would call symbolic violence. The cultural identity demands that have appeared since the 60s rarely have a monopolistic character, with some exceptions, of course, when cultures want to be a prelude to the constitution of the state or even a caliphate. But this is not central in our discussion. Okay, I think these cultural forms of expression rarely demand a monopolistic expression. Identity appears through these diverse cultural objects as the desire to practice on an egalitarian stage where all distinctions have disappeared. Cultural objects in this case are much more objects of identification, and I borrow this notion from Stuart Hall and his recent posthumous book, his lectures, Dubois in Harvard published this fall, more objects of identification than objects of distinction. It goes without saying that the production of these differences supposes something that we don't have, the mutual recognition of a common space in which these differences can be usefully represented. So the recognition of multiple forms of expression, as you mentioned, in a single society or at the global level, are, taken in a very long trend of discussions that I find the origin 40 years ago in Edward Said's Orientalism, that made explicit the process of construction of otherness as a mode of domination and brought in a form of suspicion concerning all the cultural devices developed along modern history to give an account of the non-Western symbolic and life forms. Preceded by anti-colonialist accounts such as Frantz Fanon's straightforward attack on colonial violence, and followed by subaltern feminist and queer studies, Orientalism has become the central part of a now dominant narrative about the forms of European cultural domination over the rest of the world. Dominant narrative among us, but not, practically in the globalized world. So the theoretical basis of the process of this real democracy, cultural democracy, is undoubtedly, and I would like to question it a little bit, the concept of multiculturalism. Although it is seldom acknowledged as a legal frame of action, it has become a frequent way of dealing with the multiple problems that arise from cultural and more religious diversity. Wim Kymlicka's well-known definition, is, central. The basic unit of the claims is no longer the individual, but the group that is presupposed, to a large extent, to be homogeneous and non-stratified, united. The condition of possibility of the minority claims is based, I would say, and it's a continuation of a form of domination, that's what I claim, on the sameness of the members of the group. As, in colonial anthropology, this presupposition existed, We are different individuals, and they are all the same, members of a group. So, collective identity, according to Kymlicka, is strong and it transcends other differences. There is a well-noted paradox here. In a time when the identity of the individual has been challenged by literature and the social sciences as fragmented, complex, dual, and so on, collective identity is still taken for granted as if minorities were less individualized than majorities, in our societies, or than the South would be less individualized than the North. Globalization has gone along with the emergence of neo-nationalisms, in our regions, particularly in Europe. Revamped populisms are now significant forces on both sides of the former Iron Curtain, with no hierarchy and no privilege. New contradictions have emerged, and they now shape economic markets as well as social life. In this landscape, the status of Europe, is very complicated. Because, of course, we are, responsible for the state of things. I mean, we have been dominating, and you have been Eurocentric in our definition of what culture is and should be. And now we are no longer sure about this statement, and in the meantime, I mean, if we think about Europe, we cannot prevent ourselves from linking it to some culture, and this is one of the main problems. So we are here with a sort of contradiction between, I mean, promoting Europe, and Rijeka 2020 is a case in point, and I mean acknowledging for the fact that things should not be Eurocentric any longer. So the paradox that Leila Jankovic mentioned this morning is for me central, and we have to deal with it, I mean to address it at least, is the fact that we have been talking of participation for some years now, and what seems to dominate in the citizens' behavior is political apathy, disinterest for being vocal, and more exit, to speak like Albert Eichmann, than voice, unfortunately. Okay? So I think we are all utopianists here with respect to integrating powers of culture in political life. Or should we limit ourselves to find provisional devices to avoid a kind of cultural civil war? That is not impossible. So, I'm close to the end. Sociological research has shown the long-lasting segmentation of publics, stratification, and the political as well as non-political non-participation among some categories becoming the most conspicuous form of cultural claim, increasing, I mean, ethnic, class, and generational separation. So, cultural policies, to some extent, have not succeeded in their classical aim, but have segmented and sometimes put into stronger contradictions different segments of the public. I would say that popular culture is still a good vehicle for developing a transnational cultural mood. Thus, popular music and heritage festivals that gather crowds in the summer, as well as very small alternative festivals, should be invested by militant sociologists and cultural practitioners to transform them into powerful agents of change. Public action should be taken in order to consider those spaces as genuine producers of cohesion. One of today's big cultural stakes lies in the constitution of genuine intercultural stage, which one can legitimately believe has nothing to do with the folklore meeting or with the neo-colonialist exploitation of world cultures on the stages of northern countries. Attempts should be made to engage in debates those groups of people that often remain in the margins of European identity or do not perceive themselves as capable to perform this European heritage in their everyday lives, resorting instead to their national, ethnic, or religious selves. Minority populations across Europe, notably Roma and Muslims, citizens belonging to older age groups that do not have access to intra-European mobility, e-resources and social media information, the increasing group of young unemployed people who feel marginalized from the culture of individual rights, consumption, mobility, and productivity that forms the inherent part of the official European identity. I mentioned here the non-Erasmus people, okay? And in the 90s, I finished, sociologists spoke of a coming reflexive society. I mentioned Ulrich Beck, Anthony Giddens, and Scott Lash. This society is possible, why not, if only we address the European audiences with a better understanding of how cultural legitimacy, I think I have to finish like that, legitimacy is produced and an ideological order is maintained. The social sciences have accumulated more knowledge than we generally believe. And I think we must pass it on in a communicable form and thus contribute to a real cultural democracy. And I'm done.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marijana Cvetković. I come from Belgrade, and at the very beginning, I want to thank you, to thank the organizers for inviting me, and also to thank Anna for giving us a very nice and challenging frame for this discussion. I'm a cultural producer, and I do a lot of different things in Belgrade and in the Balkan region, and I will speak and maybe propose a few questions from the perspective of a post-socialist context. I think it's important to have this voice here on this stage, and more specifically, I will speak from the perspective of a post-Yugoslav context. My colleagues already defined the field in which we are trying to find some answers, the structures of cultural policies that we have today in most of our societies. In this post-Yugoslav or post-socialist context, I think that it is very important to mark a few elements of this context when it comes to cultural policies. We have on one side top-down cultural policies and infrastructure, which is today ruled by the ruling parties and their own ideologies and their own interests. The official cultural policies created with years a huge gap between the cultural producers, the artists, theoreticians, researchers, curators, and all other cultural workers. So in the way they work, there is what comes from the top-down cultural policies is only challenges and problems. On the other side, in the culture field, that is actually mostly whose dynamics comes mostly from the civil sector or independent sector, you can find very effective bottom-up culture policies, those that create cultural and artistic dynamics in the field. And then we have a third element in this situation, which is a private sector or market-oriented culture policies that try to use capacities of both artistic field, artists, cultural workers, and the public infrastructure and public funds. So, which this means, and this is very visible in these post-socialist countries, is that private sector doesn't bring only the private money, but they compete with the independent sector for public money and also with the public institutions. This creates a huge turbulence in the artistic and cultural field, in which the roles get confused and in which you cannot separate what is a public interest and public good and what is private interest and private good. So in such situation, I see really an important structural problem and question: how can we speak about cultural democracy when we are in when we have a situation where the most of the societies worldwide have a growing difference between rich and poor. So there are very, very few examples of a different trend. So where is cultural democracy there? How can we speak about cultural democracy when we have cultural policies and educational policies that chase away arts and culture from the school curricula, where we have the media that almost don't have any more culture in their that there are no culture pages anymore, no culture shows, no culture documentaries, and so on and so on. How can we speak about cultural democracy when we have humanities departments being closed at the universities, when there are any subsidies for research in the field of culture, arts, and science, and so on and so on? So for me, this is really the most important question. How can we treat cultural democracy as an element of our social constitutions if there are these structural changes? Somehow I see that, or I recall actually the question of, or the situation where we as cultural workers and the cultural policy people try to find always a new argument why culture is important. When we speak to politicians, we always try to say mostly the same things about why culture is important. But as long as we allow culture to be an economic category, as long as we allow the market rules or market to interfere into the culture field, we will be in trouble, because this is exactly the argument for the policymakers to say we don't have money for culture. I also recall people who created Yugoslav cultural policies even during the Second World War. The idea of culture in the new socialist society was that culture is the first and most important factor in creating a new man who will be able to build the new society. So culture was not an asset. It was not something that comes after something else. It is the principle, the activating principle, which will allow people in the new society to grow, to be able to think critically, so that these people really build the new society. And this is the principle that we have to think about again, I think. I will also use this opportunity to propose something which, of course, comes from the independent scene in which I work and in which I am an activist, and which could be another principle to replace this mainstream cultural democracy discourse. This is cultural. This new principle could be cultural solidarity. Solidarity with all cultural, actors of cultural fields globally, because it is needed and we need to support each other. But not only this, I think that this solidarity should go to all different forces in the society that need support and that need to get together. And I will use the opportunity to mention one concrete example in which I also work and which I somehow would definitely place into the context of this conference. This is the example of the platform called Nomadance Academy that started in the field of contemporary dance in the Balkans after 2000, after the year of 2000, after the political changes in Serbia, which has managed to develop on the basis of solidarity, openness and inclusiveness a huge force in the field of contemporary arts and specifically contemporary dance, and give an incredible strong and articulated push to development of the regional contemporary dance scenes. This example is a proof of how things can be done and how small initiatives of this kind could really affect the situation on the field, could make small cultural policies that really make changes and that really make participation possible. I will finish with this, and I hope we will now go to debate. Thank you.
I will step down as a hands-on moderator to give the mic to, thank you panelists, sorry, started moving before I said this. Questions from the audience? Reflections, comments? I mean, we heard quite a few perspectives. On my end, the picture is even grimmer than I imagined. But definitely, I think we've got enough starting points for the after-panel discussion. So, and could you please introduce yourself before you pose a question? Thank you.
Yes, I am Kennedy Chinyowa, currently based in South Africa at the University of Tshwane University of Technology. Yes, I would like to ask Mike, thank you all for your presentations. You were questioning the issue of cultural democracy, that it has come to be, correct me if I'm wrong, for the privileged few, especially within a South African context, that these government-funded organizations like the Film Foundation and so on are serving the privileged few. But my question is now, it goes to your criticism of those who are driving the 2005 UNESCO Convention. I was in Paris in June when there was this civil society organization forum. And what I observed was the invisibility of South African civil society organizations in participating in that forum. So from your criticism, it appears as if the convention is the one that is marginalizing civil society in South Africa, and yet it is that the civil society organizations that are invisible in terms of their participation in the convention itself. So my question now is, don't you think that it's an unfair criticism if it is the civil society organizations that are not being visible in terms of participating in the convention? Thank you.
Where did the meeting take place? It was in Paris. How many people from Western Europe were able to make it because they can take a train from wherever they live in Europe, come to the meeting in Paris, and then return and be back in their own beds that night. For people to come from the Arab region, from Latin America, from Africa, it is so much more expensive. They need to get visas to be there. And I think that that's what my criticism is, that particular meeting led to the emergence of a new global civil society report on how civil society was implementing the convention. And how this report was constructed was by sending out questionnaires to a database that the people who were at that particular meeting had access to. And based on whatever responses they received, they went and constructed this report. We were creating, precisely because of the invisibility that you talk about, and not only South Africa, but Africa generally was kind of absent, numerically speaking, from that particular meeting. We created, subsequent to that meeting, the African Cultural Policy Network, which now has representation from about 23, 24 different countries. And we then actively solicited questionnaires to make sure that Africa was much more visible within that particular space. But we also then, I happened to be in Europe at the time when an editorial meeting was happening, putting that report together. And at our own expense, attended that meeting in Paris. There were 14 people who were part of this editorial committee. 10 of them were based in Western Europe, 2 of them in Asia, 1 Canadian, and myself from Africa. So when it comes to discussing these kinds of things and synthesizing the information from around the world, not only are there no questionnaires coming from Latin America because people there speak Spanish, and the questionnaires went out in English and French, nothing from the Arab region, where Arabic is kind of the primary language and the like. What I'm trying to make the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lack of awareness on the part of people who occupy positions of privilege as to what needs to happen in order to make sure that those who are invisible are given visibility. Because it is so much more difficult for those who are invisible. They don't choose to be invisible. It is much more expensive. They don't speak the same language as the people who are assuming hegemony within that particular group, et cetera, et cetera. So, I agree completely with you. Your principle is that we as civil society, instead of complaining about our not being given a space, we need to be asserting that space, and that's exactly why we organize ourselves into these organizations. At the same time, and that was the point I was trying to end with, that until our colleagues in places like Western Europe or in South Africa, white South African colleagues, recognize that in the way that they exercise their privilege, which they sometimes are unaware of, they perpetuate that invisibility, they perpetuate that marginalization, and so they need to be made aware as well of how that happens so that we can create a much more kind of integrated, collegiate expression of civil society. Sorry, long answer, but yeah.
No, but it's green. Wow, it's working. Yeah, I just need to push it. My name is Davor Mišković, and I'm coming here. I'm not coming, I'm from Rijeka, and from local non-profit organization that works in culture. And I have a very practical question for sociologists. And I really like your term of concentration of reputation that is somehow dominating the cultural world. And I'm struggling as a kind of cultural practitioner every day with that in a way because it's organized in that way. It's like a star system that is existing in a like it was existing, it's exported from Hollywood to visual arts, theater, everywhere. And we have, if you want to create certain relevant, we need to somehow include some of this kind of concentrated kind of reputation to our program. Basically, I want to ask, in this globalized world, is there any kind of practical solution to reduce this concentration?
This is a very difficult question. And so I'm afraid that I will not able to answer. But I think this is a very central question about what needs to be done. And I mean, what is the political agenda of, I mean, people who are in culture? Because of course the question is highly political and it's complex. So I don't want to answer that my answer be too long. But I think that of course the segmentation and the fragmentation of publics is inherent to I mean the capitalist mode of production of entertainment, okay, segmented publics, and that of course we cannot answer, and we have witnessed since the beginning of the conference the necessity to relocalize, okay, all the examples we had this morning in the fair are about a certain junction between the territory and the cultural actors, and of course the people. And the problem is the lack of balance between the big providers of what you said, images, schemes of behavior, and what have you, and what these people do in small places. It's not an insult. Because they matter and they are very important as acts of resistance, but also as ways of producing autonomous and closely linked to the population images, representations, and I mean structures of feeling, to speak like the late Raymond Williams. Structures of feeling. So the question maybe would be, and addressed to you, and this conference is a means of doing it, is to, I mean, create networks, channels who would propose. So, I mean, as we claim diversity, it would be difficult, but what that would claim or envisage maybe as utopias, spaces that I call the new cultural public sphere, after other, especially British sociologists, that would allow us to, I mean, deal with the contradictions, the cultural contradictions, but by not being limited by our own identity. That's why I was interested by the idea of identification and the fact that, of course, identity should never be an essence. That's what the Stuart Hall, who created with Williams and Richard Hogarth the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, claimed too. Okay, we have to deal with configurations and not essences. So we have to what I call reflexivity. In this respect would be the capacity to, I mean, to show the difference without the presupposition of otherness. That was, of course, that is the legacy of colonialism. So it's very complicated, but I'm sure it's a political issue, very important, also in Europe, because we have the South with us now in Europe, okay, in all parts of Europe. So we tend to deny it, and the populism, that was in my title, populism is the best way of denying the fact that the South is with us and that we have to deal with it as well as the South itself. And this, of course, I mean, I have no answer, so that's what I stop here. But I mean, it should trigger a very long conversation for the next 50 years, because it's what cultural democracy is about.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Mirko Petric. I have to apologize twice. First, because I teach in a sociology department, and second, because we tend to monopolize a little bit in this. So I'll be very brief. I just have a comment, it's not a question, and it is comment at Anna's remark that you presented a sort of a grim picture. I completely disagree. I think this is a picture of hope for the future, because things were, unlike in a closed circle policy, self-perpetuating discourse, you sort of stepped out into the reality, and then there was dialogue that ensued. And I think it is the recipe for hope for the future.
Yes, I comment. It's a Gramscian vision of the pessimism of intelligence and optimism of the will.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. My name is Manka Adranchpindi from Zambia. I also just have a comment and maybe a reflection, mainly from Mike's presentation. I feel that even as we prepare, even as we put in place systems to encourage cultural participation, I think we must be sensitive to two things. The first one, I think we must find a way of defining a common ground for defining participation. I feel sometimes as I work for a government agency, the way I understand participation may not be the same way my constituents understand participation. So I think that common understanding of the word participation will be very helpful, because I may feel that they are participating and they may feel they are not participating in what we are doing. So as cultural agencies, I think we must maybe find a way of identifying common grounds. The second one, I think, is the issue of equity in participation. I feel that, as Mike said, there are certain things we do, like the 2005 Convention and other, even in Zambia, we have certain policies that we put in place to encourage participation of stakeholders, but only a few are able to participate based on the capacity for them to participate, or even the cost of participation, as highlighted. So I think we also have to think of an equitable way of encouraging participation, so that we just don't have the noisy few being involved in the processes. And I think that is the challenge that we may need to start defining, so that we find a common ground of defining what participation is, but also think of the equity issues, so that we allow participation at different levels and in different ways. I thought I could just make these few comments. Thank you.
Any more questions? About the grimness of the story, I have to go back to this. The comment was not based on somewhat great picture of cultural democracy, but maybe it can be connected to the slow pace of cultural development, because this concept has been now developing for more than 50, 60 years, right? Am I right, Leila? It's the 60s, 70s. And we are still not there. And we are already talking about new concepts, while the old ones have not still sort of permeated the system and have not sort of infected the policies. And policy-wise, if nobody else has a question, I have a question for Sakarias. Going back to culture policies, going back to the boring field, away from the sociology. Participation, we've heard in the last 2 days during the seminar that Rijeka 2020 hosted, and possibly again as an introduction to our keynote tonight, with Professor Frank Fischer. Participation as a governance model, as a governance method or a principle that's implemented in a policy provisions is a process. It's a continuum without a definite end. It deals with uncertainties, with unfinishedness, with various stakeholders, with various positions, with various concepts that are constantly intermingling and interacting. So that is the principle. On the other hand, we have a policy, a structural fact that has to sort of provide coherent space for regulating the uncertain. So my question is, when we are talking about cultural democracy, so we are always juxtaposing all these concepts against the policy as this a brick wall. trying to take the bricks out and switch them with some other bricks and try to see whether this wall can then be attainable for us to climb on it or, go over it or whatever. But are we insufficiently concentrated on the wall per se, on itself, and more on the methods and principles and approaches on how we tackle the wall?
Well,
and how can we tackle it?
one brick at a time. Yeah, one brick at a time. Well, there are plenty of talk about participation actually right now in Finland. It's even mentioned in the government program on the national level. We have to or should have more participation, but no one knows what that means. That's the thing. It's really like just was said that we have to define the concepts more accurately. If it's mentioned in the government program that we need more participation to culture, and no one defines what we understand by participation, it's almost impossible to know what to do. And like you said, policies implemented in processes. You said that participation as such is a process, but also implementation of policies and building up policies, they are also processes. They are not there for eternity. Policy can also change. We have to politicize discussions. We have to politicize definitions of the important terms and bring them back to the building of policies. That's the way to smuggle these important things into the structures of policies, of building policies. That's what I think could be the way to do it. I don't know if I understood you right, but...
Of course you can.
Just because I like analogies like walls, what we do with them, and somebody on the stage said maybe deal with one brick at a time. And of course, the big question is, if everyone is saying it's a failed model, if we're repeatedly talking about 50, 60 years, the same things, is it one brick at a time, or do we take the wall down? Are we actually just moving the deck chairs and not actually solving the problem? And I suppose I would kind of say, just as we need to be clear about defining participation, completely understand why you said we don't want to spend the whole session talking about what do we mean by cultural democracy, but we do also need to question what we mean by culture. Because actually I'd challenge that premise that the media doesn't talk about culture anymore. It doesn't talk about the arts anymore. The culture shows you're talking about are art shows. And actually, if you ask most people, there's lots of culture on telly, but not the culture that we're talking about. So they are fundamental questions about whether we actually need to change what we're talking about.
No. That the master of the ceremony is telling me that this has come to an end. So before we say goodbye and before I say deep thank you to the panelists for participating, any last comments from your end? You're fine? Coffee time? Is it coffee time? You will do it? Thank you very much, right? Before the announcement of the coffee break.